Welcome to the Fundamental Beliefs Bible Study course. Today we will be studying lesson number 6, which is God's laws. We have dealt with very important basic questions during first 5 lessons. And the previous one had a title, Experience of Salvation. So we assume that if a person follows and accepts God's truth, then the experience of salvation has already been anchored in, has already been accomplished. So once a person has received God's salvation, once there is this relationship between God and the person, then there is a question: how shall a saved person live? And lesson number 6 begins answering that question. And the short answer is by God's laws. Let's therefore talk a little bit about the nature of God's laws. Section number 1, God's laws and the great controversy between God and Satan. What is a definition of sin? 1 John 3:4 says, everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. What is a definition of sin? It is lawlessness. And lawlessness is literally without law or without the law. It's breaking God's law. It's denouncing God's law. It's trying to nullify God's law. So sin is breaking of God's law. Sin is lawlessness. The second question is, read 1 John 3:8 and answer the questions. Let's read verse number 8 of the same chapter. It says here, whoever makes a practice of sinning, he is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. Here's our phrase, the devil has been sinning from the beginning. So who was the first one to break God's law? The answer is the devil was. When did God's law appear, therefore? Since devil was the first one to break God's law, then it follows that God's law already existed at that time. He, the Bible says, has been sinning from the beginning. So in the beginning, God's law was already in existence for devil to be able to break it. So we learn, therefore, that the great controversy between God and Satan has been about the attitude towards God's law. And devil had an issue with God's law. He began breaking it, violating it. Now, when we go to the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 17, there is another important statement for our topic. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. A couple of questions. What are identifying marks of the people of God? There are 2 that's given here. It says they keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus are the 2 identifying marks of the people of God. What is Satan's attitude towards them? The Bible says dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Dragon in this chapter is the devil, which is reflected in verse number 9 of Revelation 12. So, as you can see, Satan, devil, was the first one to break God's law. He was the first one to sin. Then, when we go to the book of Revelation, we see that he is furious when he sees others holding true to God's law. So the definition of sin is breaking God's law. The first lawbreaker was Satan, and he is against anyone who tries to keep God's law and makes a decision to follow God's law. He is furious. He is waging a war on those. That's our first section of the lesson. If there are any questions or discussion needed, please go ahead. If you need to speak, don't forget to unmute yourself first. So God's laws and the great controversy between God and Satan. As you could see, the law of God is at the very core, is at the very center of the problem of sin, of the revolt against God, and this controversy that ensued before the creation of our world even. That's how central this topic is. So can we proceed then? No questions? Okay. Our second section is nature of God's laws. What are God's laws given for? Let's read a couple of passages in the Bible and answer the question. Leviticus 18:5. Leviticus 18:5 says, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I'm the Lord." So, what are God's laws given for? This passage says that anyone who keeps God's rules, statutes, he shall live by them. So they are given as a way to live, and they are also safeguarding, protecting life itself. It's a formula for life, and that's the first passage. The second one is Deuteronomy 5:29. Deuteronomy 5:29, and it says, "Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and to keep all my commandments, that it might go well with them and with their descendants forever." So this is the goal of God's commandments, that it might go well with them and with their descendants. So wellness is another goal of God's commandments. Let's take a look at Proverbs 3, verses 1 and 2, the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you." A number of blessings we see here. Length of days, longevity, years of life, and peace they will add to you. This is the purpose of God's commandments. Now let's take a look at a couple of statements from apostolic writings. First one being Epistle of James, James Epistle, chapter 1, verse 25. James 1:25. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So as you can see, blessing is what comes as a result of doing the commandments. Blessing. Another one, Epistle to Romans, chapter 7, verse 7. Romans 7:7. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet, if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So another function and purpose of the law is to give a definition for sin. I would have not known sin if it had not been for the law. So the purpose of the law is simple in this text. It's to give a definition for sin. It's to help us know what is sinful, what is evil, and vice versa, what is good. What is revealed in the book of Psalms, chapter 111, verses 7 and 8, about the nature of God's law. The book of Psalms, chapter 111, verses 7 and 8. The works of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy. They are established forever and ever, to be performed with faithfulness and uprightness. Something is very important stated here. His precepts, which is the same as commandments or statutes or laws, are trustworthy, and they are established forever and ever. So the law is given for indefinite times. Another passage which is like that is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, verse 17. Luke 16:17. It says, but it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. So another statement which is similar, that the law will have its authority always. Even a little dot shall not become void till heaven and earth stand. So when we are talking about the nature of God's laws, another aspect of them is that they are eternal. They are given for forever. This concludes our second section of the lesson about the nature of God's laws. And now if you have any questions, if there is any discussion or your comments, please go ahead and offer them. Looks like we're all on the same page, right? That's good. Let me share my screen with you again, and we will go to section number 3, which is God's laws classification. There are many God's commandments, and most of the people know about 10. Some have heard about 2 commandments, and less people know that there are 613 commandments. And the question is how these commandments correlate to each other. Let's take a look at a couple of passages that deal with their classification. First one is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 28. Luke 10, 25 through 28. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. So here are the questions. What commandments are mentioned? There are 2. Love God and love people. Love your neighbor. Second question, who mentioned these commandments? It's interesting to note that Jesus was asked the question, verse 25, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? But Jesus points the lawyer to the Torah, to the Bible, to Pentateuch. He said to him, What is written in the law? So, answering the question, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus directs the one who is asking him the question to the law and asks, what is written in the law? How do you read it? So then he answered, he meaning the lawyer. So here's our question again. Who mentioned these commandments? In that conversation, in that particular instance, it was the lawyer who quoted these 2 commandments from the Pentateuch, from the Torah. Where are they taken from? The text says from the law. But specifically, one is taken from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, and which is love your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul, and so forth. And the second is taken from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, which says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now let's go to the book of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 35 through 40. 22, 35 through 40. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Let's answer a couple of statements, whether they are true or false. First one, these commandments were first spoken or given by Jesus. True or false? The answer is false. Jesus is quoting them. Then the next statement, Jesus Christ is repeating Old Testament commandments. True or false? Answer is true. He is quoting. Third statement, these commandments replace all other commandments. True or false? False. The statement is like this. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Jesus doesn't say, instead of all the commandments in the law, I now give you two. No, these two, they are from the same law, from the same Torah. It just, they are fundamental, and they serve as a as the platform on which everything else is built. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So it's like a foundation for everything else. So they are not to replace everything else, it's to support and to be a foundation for everything else. So these commandments replace all other commandments. This is a false statement. The next one is, these commandments are the foundation for the whole law. That's correct. And the foundation of the Old Testament is love for God and people. The answer is absolutely correct. So, as you can see, we have basically one commandment. And that one commandment is to love. To love God, then love your neighbor. So the commandment of love towards God and towards people is the foundation of everything else. Then on these two, everything else is placed. Everything else is constructed. So any commandment that we take, whether it be you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, this would be showing us how specifically to love God. Or shall we take, you shall not steal? That would be a specification and detailization of how to love your neighbor and so forth. So Jesus says that these two, they are foundational. And on these two, all the law and the prophets are built. So the Ten Commandments, then, they are also even further explanation or detailization of these basic two commandments, which is love God and love your neighbor. And then all 1613 commandments, which is a traditional number for all do's and don'ts in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, they are also about how to love God and how to love people. So this is the classification. We have two fundamental ones on which everything else, all other commandments are built, and then the whole Bible is built as well. So this is the end of section number 3. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead. I'm glad we're sailing very smoothly, and it might be helping that for some of you it's a review rather than a study. Okay, so let's then move to section number 4, which is titled Universality of God's Laws. Whether God's laws are universal. The first question is this: Who do God's laws apply to? Romans 3:19. Romans 3:19. It says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Here's the question. Who do God's laws apply to? And the answer is to the whole world. The law, when it speaks to those who are under the law, and the whole world is then accountable to God. So there is this clear statement that God's laws, they are applicable towards the whole world. Now let's take a couple of case studies. Did Cain know God's law? The book of Genesis chapter 4 verses 6 and 7, they give us the story. Genesis 4, 6 and 7. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? Or in other versions, don't you lift up your face? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So this conversation shows something about what Cain knows. He knows how to do well. He knows what it means and how it feels to not do well or do good. That's one description. Now let's go to another one, which is 1 John 3:12. 1 John 3:12, which is also about this incident. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. So this passage states that Cain's deeds were evil before he killed his brother. And since his brother's deeds were righteous and his, Cain's deeds were evil, that was the reason that he decided to kill his brother. So what was evil, not only the killing, which was about to take place at this point in time when God is speaking to Cain, but that Cain's action prior to that, his actions were evil. And that's why his face was fallen. That's why he was not lifting up his face. And God is pointing to that fact. So, did Cain know God's law? The answer is most definitely. The expression of his face showed that he understood that what he did was wrong, what he was about to do was also sinful. He understood that. Therefore, he had an idea and he had an understanding of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. Now, another example. Did Noah know God's laws? Let's compare Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, and Leviticus chapter 11, first 8 verses. Genesis 7, verses 1 and 2. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. So, a question for you. If you were tasked with this assignment, how would you differentiate between clean and unclean animals? how would you go about this task? What criteria would you use? Who is a clean animal? Like, is a cat clean animal? It cleans itself nice. Is a cow clean animal? Compare the way that a typical cow looks and how clean it is, and a cat, for example, right? So, I mean, a cat is much cleaner than a cow, for example. But in biblical terms, when we go to Leviticus chapter 11, verses 1 through 8, this is what it says. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, These are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, and chews the cud among the animals, you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, because it chews the cud, but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the rock badger, because it chews the cud, but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the hare, because it chews the cud, but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. You shall not eat any of their flesh. You shall not touch their carcasses. They are unclean to you. So, as you can see, the sign to tell apart which animal is clean and unclean has to do with animals' physical features, and also the internal structure of their digestive system, whether the animal chews the cud, which means basically that an animal first eats grass or anything that it does, and then it would ruminate on it, and later it would regurgitate and then chew it again and would send it to the second section of the stomach and so forth. That's about the digestive system, and also the anatomical features would be that the clean animal, it would have hoofs and they will be split, right? So a cow actually is a clean animal, and a cat is unclean in biblical language and in biblical distinction. So here's the main point. Noah knew how to tell them apart. When God says, you shall take only two unclean animals, a male and a female, and then X number of clean animals, there is no list given on which ones are clean and which ones are not clean. There are no signs, no physical features, no criteria given, but Noah just knows. So it shows that he had a knowledge of what animals are clean and what are not, and which are not clean. Another example, let's compare Genesis chapter 8 verse 20 with Leviticus chapter 1. Genesis 8:20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offering on the altar. That's Genesis chapter 8 verse 20. So as you can see, when Noah was offering a burnt offering, which is one type of 5 given in the Bible, he took clean animals and clean birds and offered them. So when later we go to Leviticus chapter 1, here's what we find. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish." Then there are laws on how to offer the animal. Then it says in verse 10, if his gift for burnt offering is from the flock, from the sheep or goats, he shall bring a male without blemish. And then we have a description on how to offer a sacrifice. Then verse 14, if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or pigeons and so forth. So what you could see that what animals Noah took to make the burnt offering are the same types of animals that Leviticus chapter 1 prescribes to use. We can see that Noah, first of all, knows about this type of offering, which is a burnt offering, and he is offering the correct animals in accordance with Levitical laws. The book of Leviticus will be written many centuries later, but Noah already knows the laws governing sacrificial rites. And another case study, which is about Abraham. Did Abraham know God's law? The book of Genesis, chapter 26, verse 5. Genesis 26, 5. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Did Abraham know God's law? Most definitely. It says that he kept them, and this description has 3 different words, all in plural: statutes, commandments, laws, right? So it's not just one commandment, it's many. And Abraham knew them, and he was obedient to them. So this was our 4th section, universality of God's laws. We see that all commandments are given for all people, and this broad statement is could be verified by a number of case studies. So even those people who lived before the text of the law was given in a written form, they knew God's commandments, and those who wanted to serve God, they used them and lived according to them and kept them. Now, if you have any questions, please go ahead and we could talk. I don't hear or see any. So then let's go to our last section, which is section number 5, titled God's Laws and Salvation Mechanism.
Based upon that principle. Yeah, based upon that principle.
What was that, Dana?
Based upon the principle that everyone should know God's law, was there anyone mentioned who did not know God's law? I mean, even the devil knows God's law.
Yes, you see, over time, of course, when people drew away from God, with each generation, the measure of knowledge of God's commandments diminished over time, to the point that there were some people who had just very basic, rudimentary understanding and knowledge of God's laws and commandments. But that's because, like if a parent is not obedient or only half obedient, then his or her children are raised with just half of the knowledge, and then the next generation loses it even more. So that was one of the reasons that God decided to put everything in writing, to just have an absolute and intact ideal and measure to use to give definitions of evil and good. So, but that's not to say that God's law was only given on Mount Sinai. So yes, there was some loss of the measure of understanding and knowledge of the law of God, but it was from absolute perfect knowledge to slowly dissipating and losing bits and pieces, so that it required a written document.
Excellent answer.
Thank you, Dana. Okay, so let's go to our last section. God's laws and salvation mechanism. There is this widespread idea that in the so-called Old Testament times, people were saved by the works of the law. That supposedly the way to get saved was to earn your salvation by keeping God's commandments. And then, supposedly, when Jesus came, when the grace was offered through his ministry, then we are no longer saved by the works of the law, but by God's grace. So let's take a look at some biblical passages and try to verify whether that's the case. What was the basis of spiritual life for Abel, Enoch, and Noah? The book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 4 through 7. Hebrews 11, verses 4 through 7. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he could not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he commended the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So we have three people mentioned. First, we have Abel, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice. through his faith. Then, by faith, Enoch was taken up. He was taken by God to heaven without seeing death. By faith, Noah was constructing the ark. So we have three people, and then also, if you go on, by faith, Abraham, and so forth. So what was the basis of spiritual life for Abel, Enoch, and Noah? The answer is faith. Faith motivated them, it prompted them to be obedient. And how did Abraham become righteous? The book of Genesis 15:6. Genesis 15:6. It says, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So righteousness was through faith of Abraham. Where does Paul quote from? In Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 10:37. Let's take a look at one of them. Romans 1:17. 1:17 says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So this phrase, the righteous shall live by faith, is quoted 3 times by Apostle Paul in his letters, in his epistles. And this is a fundamental statement. This is such a fundamental statement for Apostle Paul and the whole idea of receiving righteousness or being declared righteous because of your faith. The righteous shall live by faith. But here's the question. Where does Paul quote from in these 3 places where he is writing about righteous being righteous because of faith? Let me go back. It says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written. You see, it's a quotation. The righteous shall live by faith is not a statement that Paul generated or the Holy Spirit revealed to him in the New Testament time. No, he is quoting from what is written. And here's where it is found the first time. It's the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright with him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. This is the foundation. So this is taken from an Old Testament era prophet's book, Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous shall live by faith. As you could see, that was the foundation of spiritual experience long before Jesus Christ and long before Apostle Paul. The last question for today is this. What does faith do with God's law? Since righteousness has always been through faith, how does God's law, how do God's commandments fit into this picture? What does faith do with God's law? Romans 3:31. Romans 3:31. It says, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. So there is no contradiction between faith and keeping the law, or grace and keeping the law. Do we overthrow the law by faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. So when we are talking about God's laws and salvation mechanism, people have never been saved by the works of the law. There has never been an era where God would do accounting with people. Meaning, if you do one good deed more than the sum of your evil deeds, then you are saved. That has never been the case. People have never been saved by the works of the law. They have always been saved and counted righteous through faith. But when we have that genuine faith, it is seen and it is revealed and it is practiced and it is realized through keeping God's law. Otherwise, the faith is not genuine. So, the formula is very simple. We are saved and declared righteous by faith, and then if we go on living the next day, we are governed by God's commandments. That's the relation between faith and God's law.